6 certified technicians, 4 days, 0 answers. A $5 million contract was bleeding out on a cold garage floor, and the most powerful woman in the luxury automotive world was running out of time, running out of options, and running out of pride. The car that couldn't be fixed. The mechanic nobody wanted. The billionaire who let a good man get humiliated and walked away. What happens when arrogance meets its reckoning at 2 o'clock in the morning? If you're new here, hit subscribe, because the stories I bring you don't pull punches. Drop your city and country in the comments right now. I want to see how far this story travels. And stay with me until the very end, because what this quiet man does in the dark, with no audience and no applause, is something I guarantee you will not forget. The garage opened at 7, not because a sign said so, because Caleb intervened, not because Caleb Whitaker had ever printed official business hours on a placard or hung anything professional looking above the door of his two-bay repair shop. It opened at 7 because that was when Noah woke up, and Noah waking up meant the day had officially started whether Caleb was ready for it or not. On this particular Tuesday morning in early October, Caleb was not ready for it. He'd been under a '94 Silverado until past midnight trying to sort out a fuel pump issue that had no business being as complicated as it turned out to be, and when the alarm on his phone went off at 6:15, he lay on the narrow cot in the back room of the shop for a solid 4 minutes, staring at the water-stained ceiling, and having a very private argument with himself about whether any of this was sustainable. The answer, as usual, was unclear. "Dad." Noah's voice came from behind the half-open door that separated the shop's small back room from the main bay. 6 years old, small for his age, with his mother's eyes, and Caleb's unfortunate habit of waking up looking like he'd already been in a fight with something. "Bud, the cereal's gone." Caleb sat up. "Which cereal?" "The good one." That meant the colored one with the marshmallows, which Caleb bought once a month as a compromise between being a decent father and knowing that feeding a child pure sugar at 6 in the morning was exactly the kind of parenting decision that would come back to haunt him. Check the cabinet above the stove. There should be the oat one. A pause. That's not the good one. I know. We'll get more this weekend. Pause longer this time. Kind of pause that 6-year-olds deploy when they're calculating how hard to push. Okay. Caleb exhaled, got up, pulled on the same work pants he'd worn yesterday and the day before because laundry was a weekend activity and this was a Tuesday, and went to start the coffee maker and figure out the morning. This was their life. Ordinary and a little ragged at the edges, conducted mostly inside a building that smelled permanently of motor oil and rubber, and the faint metallic sweetness of brake fluid. The apartment above the shop had 2 small bedrooms, a bathroom where the water took 3 full minutes to get warm, and a kitchen window that looked out over the alley, where Mrs. Pacheco from the bodega next door hung her mop every morning like she was marking time. It wasn't what anyone would call a beautiful life, but it was theirs, and Caleb had learned slowly, painfully, in the years since, the funeral that ownership mattered more than aesthetics. He made the oat cereal. He made the coffee. He sat across from Noah at the small table and watched his son eat with the focused seriousness that children bring to food they only tolerate. And he thought about the Silverado and whether the replacement pump he'd ordered would actually arrive by Thursday. And he did not think about Europe or the research or the version of himself that used to walk differently. That version was a long time ago. Crestmont Motor Gallery didn't have a zip code that normal people had occasion to visit. It sat at the end of a curved private drive off the city's wealthiest commercial corridor, flanked on both sides by mature trees that a landscape architect had positioned with the same deliberate care that Caleb once used to seat engine bearings. The building itself was a long, low structure of glass and brushed steel, designed to look simultaneously like I'm in a showroom, because it was, depending on which room you were standing in and who you were standing next to. Adeline Carrington had bought the business 6 years ago, when she was 24 and people in the industry were still deciding whether to take her seriously. She had made that decision easy for them by not waiting for their verdict. She'd grown up watching her father move money around with the same casual authority that other men used to move furniture, and she'd inherited from him a very specific kind of patience, the kind that doesn't look like patience at all from the outside, but is really just a very long game being played very quietly. By the time she turned by the time she turned 30, Crestmont was the most prestigious collector vehicle gallery in the region, and Adeline Carrington was the kind of person whose phone calls got returned on the first ring. She was not, by most accounts, a warm person. She was fair. She was precise. She held her staff to exacting standards and held herself to ones that were slightly more exacting than that. She remembered names, details, the specific preferences of every significant client. She had a talent for reading a room that bordered on unnerving, and she used it the way a surgeon uses a scalpel efficiently, without sentiment. But warm? No, that wasn't the word people used. On this same Tuesday morning, Adeline was in her office on the second floor of Crestmont, standing at the floor-to-ceiling window that overlooked the main service bay below, holding a coffee she hadn't touched yet. Yes, he'd intervened, watching what was happening on the floor with an expression that she was working very hard to keep neutral. What was happening on the floor was not good. The car in question sat at the center of Bay 1, like a patient that had been worked on by too many doctors and was getting worse with each intervention. It was a 1971 Venturi Speciale, one of fewer than 30 ever produced. This particular example finished in a deep burgundy that had aged into something close to the color of old wine. It belonged to Arthur Pembroke, who was one of Crestmont's most important collectors, and it was supposed to be the centerpiece of Friday's exhibition. It had not started in 4 days. 3 of Adeline's in-house technicians had examined it. A specialist had flown in from Atlanta. Another had been consulted remotely from somewhere in Germany. The diagnostic computers had produced a cascade of error codes that contradicted each other in ways that the specialists found alternately fascinating and maddening, and which had ultimately led to the current situation, but he knew what was wrong. Nobody was willing to say so plainly, and everyone was starting to look sideways at each other, in the way that people do when they're quietly preparing to explain why the problem is actually someone else's fault. Bryce Langford, Crestmont's technical director, was at this moment standing beside, with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the expression he wore when he was about to say something he'd probably rehearsed. Adeline watched him. She'd hired Bryce 4 years ago for his resume, which was genuinely impressive, and had spent the subsequent 4 years learning that a resume and a person are different documents entirely. He was good at managing processes. He was excellent at maintaining the appearance of control. He was considerably less good at the moments when control was actually slipping, and the appearance of it became impossible to maintain. This, she sensed, was going to be one of those moments. She picked up her coffee. It was cold. She drank it anyway. It was a Wednesday, not the Tuesday of the serial conversation, but the day after, the day that would turn out to matter when Caleb drove Noah across town for a replacement intake gasket for a client's older BMW. He almost didn't go to Crestmont. The part he needed could have come from 2 other suppliers. One of them had been wrong about a specification before, and the resulting hour Caleb had lost correcting it had cost him more in time than the marginal inconvenience of driving an extra 20 minutes was worth. Crestmont's parts counter was reliable. He'd used it twice before, both times with a transaction so ordinary that he'd barely registered the place as anything more than a tall glass building with good inventory. Came with him because there was no other option on a Wednesday afternoon. School, having let out at 2, and the neighbor who sometimes watched him having a dentist appointment. Didn't mind. He brought his red toolbox. It was a toy, a battered plastic case with a yellow handle that he'd been given on his 4th birthday, filled with small plastic tools that had somehow achieved a level of wear, suggesting they'd been used on actual machinery. He carried it with the serious authority of a professional, which Caleb had long since stopped finding amusing, and now found simply moving, the way the things children do without self-consciousness often are. They went through the side entrance to the parts counter. Caleb gave the part number. The counter staff looked it up, confirmed they had it, and went to pull it. Standard transaction. 4 minutes? Maybe 5. It was during those 4 minutes, while Caleb stood at the counter with Noah beside him, arranging his toy wrenches in order of size on the counter's edge, that Bryce Langford appeared. He was walking through the side corridor with another man, a technician, from the look of his clothes, and he stopped when he saw Caleb and Noah at the counter. because he recognized Caleb, because he didn't. Help you, Bryce said, though the way he said it made clear that helping was not what he was actually offering. Parts pickup, Caleb said without turning fully around. He'd heard that tone before. He'd learned to calibrate his response to it, which was to give it as little surface area as possible. This is the professional parts counter, Bryce said. Retail customers use the front. Caleb turned around then. He looked at Bryce for a moment. The pressed shirt, the laminated badge, the way he was standing slightly wider than necessary. I've used this counter twice before. Intake gasket, 43 series. They're pulling it now. I'm not sure who helped you but... Bryce, the technician beside him said it quietly, a warning. Bryce ignored it. His eyes had moved to Noah and to the red toolbox, and something shifted in his expression, not quite contempt, but its close cousin, the one that people with a certain kind of insecurity deploy against things that seem beneath them, looked up. He was 6. He understood tone of voice the way all children do, with perfect animal accuracy, even when the words themselves required translation. It's my toolbox, Noah said. He said it the way you state a simple fact to someone who seems confused. Bryce made a sound not quite a laugh, more like the noise that substitutes for one when you want the effect without committing to the real thing. Your toolbox. He looked at Caleb at the worn jeans, the work boots with the left sole starting to separate slightly at the toe, the old canvas jacket. Tell you what, come back tomorrow with your receipt, and we'll figure out whether this is actually an authorized purchase. Caleb was quiet for a moment. My receipt, he said. Store policy. Professional accounts require verification. I'm on your system. Run the name. Whitaker Auto Works. Bryce didn't move toward the computer. I'll need to verify that. The parts counter staff member came back with the gasket in a box. He looked at Bryce, looked at Caleb, and set the box on the counter with the careful neutrality of someone who had been here before and knew better than to pick a side. How much? Caleb said to the staff member. The staff member quoted the price. Caleb pulled a card from his wallet and paid. He picked up the box, looked at Bryce again, not angrily, which somehow made it worse, and then looked down at Noah. Time to go, bud. Noah gathered his toy wrenches back into the red toolbox with the same methodical care he always gave them. He snapped the yellow latch. He looked up at Bryce with the clear, unclouded directness that 6-year-olds have before they learn to be diplomatic. My dad fixes engines, Noah said, real ones. And they left. Adeline had been on the mezzanine. She hadn't intended to witness it. She'd been walking back from the archive room, where she'd spent an unproductive hour looking through records for anything that might give her team a useful reference point on the Venturi engine. And the mezzanine walkway above the parts counter area was simply the fastest route back to her office. She'd stopped when she heard Bryce's tone. She'd watched the whole thing. The man at the counter. The quiet way he held himself, not submissive, but deliberately still, the way people are when they've decided not to give a situation more than it deserves. The child with the red toolbox. The staff member's careful neutrality. Bryce standing the way he always stood when he thought he had the advantage. She watched the little boy tell Bryce what his father did. She watched them leave. She stood there for another moment. And then she turned and walked back to her office because she had a dead engine and a Friday deadline and 47 other things that needed her attention, and she told herself that she would speak to Bryce about his conduct later when the Pembroke situation was resolved. She sat down at her desk. She opened the file on the Venturi engine. She thought about the way the man at the counter had looked at Bryce, not with anger, not with embarrassment, with a kind of weary patience that suggested he'd looked at people exactly like Bryce before and found them, ultimately, not worth the energy. She pushed the thought aside and got back to work. This was what she told herself about it after. That it was a judgment call, that she had priorities, that intervening in a staff dispute in the middle of the parts counter wasn't the right approach, and that she would handle it through proper channels. She told herself these things with the fluency of someone who had learned to justify to herself most of the decisions she made quickly, and she mostly believed them, but she didn't entirely believe them. That part she kept to herself. By Thursday evening, the situation at Crestmont had moved past critical and into something that didn't have a good word attached to it. He'd intervened. Bryce had, That afternoon stood in Adeline's office and told her in language carefully designed to distribute responsibility evenly that the engine could not be repaired by any technician currently available, not in the time remaining. The modifications Venturi had made to the original factory specification were too particular, the damage too obscure, the diagnostic systems too confused by the contradictions in the engine's behavior. His recommendation was to contact Arthur Pembroke and negotiate a substitution. A different vehicle, something comparable, a workaround. Adeline had listened to all of this, with her hands flat on her desk and her expression giving away nothing. When Bryce finished, she said, "Thank you, Bryce," in a way that meant the conversation was over, and Bryce left, and she sat alone in her office and allowed herself exactly 90 seconds of something she would not have called panic, but which occupied the same space. Arthur Pembroke was not a man who accepted workarounds graciously. More than that, and this was the part that had kept her awake, the previous 2 nights she had promised him the original car, a comparable car, not a substitute. She had told him specifically, 3 weeks ago at his estate, looking at photographs of the Burgundy Speciale on her phone, that she would have it exhibition ready for Friday. Arthur had built the entire event around it. His guests were expecting it. His story about acquiring it, the years he'd spent tracking the provenance, the relationship with the original owner's estate, all of that required the car in question to actually be present. Substituting a different vehicle wasn't a workaround. It was a lie. And Adeline had learned, at some cost and over some years, that the kind of business she was trying to build could not survive being in the business of lying to people like Arthur Pembroke. It would survive one such lie about as long as a hairline crack survives a high-rev engine. She called her assistant.
"I need you to pull everything you can find," she said.
On specialists with experience in Venturi modified engines. People who've worked on standard production Venturis. People who know the modified cars, the custom work, and her assistant, a precise young woman named Claire, who had a gift for finding things that weren't meant to be findable, came back 45 minutes later. "There's almost nothing recent," Claire said. "A few academic papers from a decade ago. Some forum posts from enthusiast communities. One name keeps coming up in citations." "What name?" "Whitaker. Caleb Whitaker. He apparently published research on Venturi's engineering methodology about 8 years ago, never formally released it, circulated in draft form, but specialists referenced it for years afterward. I found 3 separate German technical papers that cite his analysis of Venturi's resonance balancing approach." Adeline was quiet. She asked. "That's the thing," Claire said. "He dropped off completely after the research. No conference appearances, publications, no professional profile anywhere. I ran the name through business registration records, and a pause. He has a repair shop, 2 bays, licensed for domestic and light commercial vehicles. It's about 20 minutes from here." Adeline thought about the man at the parts counter, about the still way he'd held himself, about a child with a red toolbox full of toy wrenches arranged in order of size. "Get me the address," she said. She drove herself. Was the first decision, not because she was being humble. Adeline Carrington did not perform humility, having learned early that performed humility is simply arrogance wearing different clothes, but because arriving at a 2-bay garage in a car with a driver felt like exactly the wrong entrance for what she was about to ask. She parked on the street outside. It was nearly 8 in the evening, and the garage's main bay doors were down, but there was a light on inside, visible through the gap at the bottom of the roller door, and she could hear something, a radio, turned down low. Beneath it, the occasional sound of metal on metal. She knocked on the side door. Silence. Then footsteps. The door opened, and Caleb Whitaker stood there in the same work pants and jacket she remembered from the parts counter 2 days ago, holding a wrench with a grease smear along his left forearm that he hadn't noticed or hadn't bothered with. At her with the expression of someone who doesn't immediately recognize a face out of context. And the expression didn't really change, which she hadn't expected. "Miss Carrington," he said, "Mr. Whitaker." She paused. "I'd like to talk to you. If you have a few minutes." He studied her for a moment. Suspiciously, exactly, but carefully, the way people look at things they're trying to accurately assess. Then he stepped back from the door. "Sure," he said. The inside of the shop was neat in the way that working spaces get neat, not clean, but organized. Everything in a place that made sense relative to everything else. A part shelf along one wall, a rolling cabinet with labeled drawers, a workbench with good lighting. In the corner, on a wooden stool that had been pushed up against the bench, a small shape was curled under a blanket. Asleep, apparently, with the red toolbox on the floor beside the stool. He stays here evenings when I'm working late, Caleb said, as an explanation, but as a fact being stated. The apartment's upstairs. I know, Adeline said. Immediately. Not because I looked up the address. The business registration. I'm sorry, that sounds. It's fine. He moved to the workbench, set the wrench down, turned to face her with his arms at his sides. What did you need? She hadn't planned the order she would say it in. She was a person who planned things, so the absence of a plan was notable. She stood in the garage of this man she'd watched get humiliated 2 days ago and had done nothing to help, and she said the thing she hadn't planned. I saw what happened at the parts counter. Wednesday. I was on the mezzanine. Caleb said nothing. I should have come down, she said. I didn't. I told myself it was a judgment call about timing and priorities, and it's not an honest account of why I walked away. The silence that followed was the kind that could be taken in several directions. Caleb let it sit for a moment, and Adeline didn't try to fill it, which took more discipline than most things she did in a given day. Is that why you came? He said. Partly. What's the other part? She told him about the car. She told him about the Venturi Speciale, the exhibition, the 4 days and 6 technicians, and the contradictory diagnostic codes. She told him what Bryce had said that afternoon, and what she'd decided in response. She told him about Claire finding his name, and the research, and the citations. She did not tell him it would be fine, or that it was probably an easy fix, or that she was sure he could handle it. She had no idea if he could handle it. And she'd found that telling people things you don't know to be true has a way of becoming visible in the middle of the conversation. When she finished, Caleb was quiet for a long moment. He turned and looked at Noah, still asleep in the corner, one small hand curled beside his face. Then he looked back at Adeline. Alessandro Venturi, he said. A question. Just the name, said in a way that was different from how he'd said everything else. Yes, she said. He was quiet again. Adeline had the sense of watching someone have an internal conversation that she wasn't part of, which was an unusual experience for her. I can't promise anything, he said finally. I need to see it. That's all I'm asking. Tonight? The exhibition is Friday morning. He looked at Noah again. Give me 40 minutes to get him settled upstairs, he said. I'll meet you there. He arrived at Crestmont at 9:40, with a leather notebook under his arm and a canvas bag that clinked when he set it down. Adeline had arranged for the service bay to be cleared of everyone except herself and the one staff member who had the overnight key. She'd thought about whether to have Bryce present and had decided, without deliberating on it too long, that she would explain the decision later than manage Bryce's response in real time. The car was under a cover. Caleb walked to it and pulled the cover back himself, without asking, and stood looking at it for a moment in the way that people with specific knowledge look at things not casually, but with attention that has somewhere to land. Has anyone opened the fuel assembly? He asked. Third day, the staff member said. One of the external consultants. What did they find? Ran a full scope on the injectors. Everything was in spec. Caleb nodded slowly, which wasn't the response the staff member had apparently expected, because the staff member looked at Adeline, who kept her expression neutral. Caleb opened the canvas bag and took out a modified stethoscope, older, clearly custom in some way, with a different chest piece than the standard type. He looked at it for a second, then at the engine compartment. There's a process to this, he said, not to anyone in particular. It takes time. It's not going to look like anything dramatic. We have time, Adeline said. He looked at her. It might be 6 hours. It might be more. We have time, she said again. He nodded, opened the notebook to a page that was covered in handwritten notations, not standard techno, but looked almost musical, curves and intervals, and small numbered annotations. He studied it for a moment. Then he leaned into the engine compartment and placed the stethoscope at a specific point and went quiet. Adeline sat down on a parts crate and settled in to wait. This was the part she would remember, Later, not the moment the engine started, not the phone call to Arthur, not what happened afterward with Bryce. This part, sitting in the cold of the service bay at 10 o'clock at night, watching a man work with the concentrated stillness of someone who isn't performing anything, just working. Listening to an engine with an instrument that looked like it belonged in a previous century, moving it by millimeters, stopping, listening again. There was something almost meditative about it. She didn't say that out loud, because Caleb struck her as exactly the kind of person who would find that observation annoying. She got out her own notebook and started going through her Friday logistics instead. It was past midnight when he spoke, not to report progress, just to break the silence, which had by then become the particular kind of thick silence that settles in shared spaces after several hours. Venturi trained under a sound engineer before he trained as a mechanical engineer, Caleb said. He wasn't looking at her. He was still looking at the engine. Most people in the field know that as a biographical detail. Don't really understand what it meant for how he worked. Adeline set down her pen. What did it mean? He didn't think of the engine as a mechanical system. He thought of it as more like an instrument, not metaphorically. Actually like an instrument where the components were in relationship to each other acoustically, not just mechanically. Vibration, resonance, everything had to be in balance in ways that didn't show up on standard diagnostics because standard diagnostics weren't measuring what he considered the important variables. The modifications to this engine made the relationship between the components more precise and more fragile, Caleb said. Factory spec has tolerances built in. Venturi's modified spec had almost none, which means if someone touched something even to look at it, even to check it, and didn't understand exactly what they were looking at, he paused. The fuel assembly, the specialist who checked it, he wouldn't have known what he was disturbing. He said this without particular heat, which was somehow more accurate than condemnation would have been. You can't fault him. You'd have to know the research to know it was even there. Adeline picked her pen back up. Put it down again. You said your research was never formally published. Why not? A pause. He shifted position, moved the stethoscope 2 centimeters to the left, listened. Personal circumstances, he said. She understood that this was the end of that particular line of inquiry. They were quiet again for a while. Outside, somewhere on the street beyond the building, a car went past with its radio too loud, and then it was quiet again. I'm going to need a material, he said. Specific alloy. I doubt you have it. Tell me what you need. He wrote it on a page of the notebook and tore it out and gave it to her. She looked at it. It's 1 a.m. I know, he said. He went back to the engine. You asked me here. Adeline got out her phone and started making calls. It took him until 2:15 in the morning to locate it precisely. Wafer-thin isolation plate custom fabricated. Nothing like it in any standard parts catalogs, seated deep within the fuel assembly. At the junction of the primary injector rail and the resonance chamber that Venturi had added to the original engine block. When Caleb finally got to it, with the careful systematic disassembly of someone who understood that the order of things mattered as much as the things themselves, he held it up under the work light and studied it for a long moment without speaking. Adeline stood beside him. There, he said. She looked. She couldn't see it at first, and then she could. A hairline deviation at the plate's edge, almost invisible. The kind of damage that a scanner would skip past because it didn't fit any recognized damage pattern in the system. Displaced, she said. Displaced, and then when someone applied pressure to check it, without knowing it was load-bearing, in a way that standard components aren't microscopically cracked along the stress point. He turned it carefully in his hands. If you put this back in, the engine might run for an hour. Run for 5 minutes. Then it'll stop again, same as before. So we need a replacement. We need a replacement made from the same alloy spec and to the same dimensional tolerance. He gave her a number, 1/10 of a millimeter. I'll call Claire. At 2 a.m. Claire is used to it, Adeline said and got out her phone. The alloy came from a specialty metals supplier. 3 cities over who happened to have a night shift manager, who happened to owe a favor to someone Adeline knew, and who was willing to drive a small quantity to a courier point for overnight delivery. It arrived at Crestmont at 4:15. Caleb fabricated the replacement plate himself at the workbench in Bay 1. using tools he'd brought in the canvas bag. He measured it 6 times before he was satisfied. He measured it a 7th time because he wasn't fully satisfied, and he needed to be. He rebuilt the engine in reverse order of disassembly, component by component, with the same focused quiet he'd brought to the whole night. Adeline watched. She could have left. She had a couch in her office upstairs. She had a car and a house with an actual bed in it. She stayed because leaving felt, for reasons she didn't examine too closely, like the wrong thing to do. At 3:40 in the morning, Caleb straightened up, set his wrench down, and stepped back from the engine. He looked at it. He looked at his notes. He said, "Try it." Adeline looked at him. "You want to be the one," he said. It wasn't a question. She got in the driver's seat. The interior of the car smelled like old leather and something faint she couldn't identify, the particular accumulation of 6 decades of existence. Her hand found the ignition. She turned the key. The V12 caught and ran and found its note, and the sound that came out of it was, she would try to describe this later and find that language wasn't quite built for it, something between a roar and a chord. Rich, multiple, each cylinder contributing its individual voice to something that was more than the sum of its parts. Caleb stood with his arms at his sides and listened to it. He looked, Adeline thought, the way people look when they hear a piece of music they know very well and haven't heard for a long time. She cut the engine. The silence afterward was its own thing. "It'll run," she said. "It'll run," he said. He picked up his notebook, closed it, and started packing his canvas bag. Adeline sat in the driver's seat of a car that was worth more money than most people's houses and looked at a man with grease on his arms and a worn canvas bag who had just done what 6 trained specialists had declared impossible. Yes, he'd intervened. She thought about the things she'd told herself Wednesday afternoon on the mezzanine. She got out of the car. "Caleb," she said. He looked up. She didn't have a speech prepared. She had, in fact, nothing prepared. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. Not warmly, not coldly. The nod of a professional who has completed a job and is satisfied with how it turned out. He picked up the canvas bag. "Send the invoice to the business address," she said. "I will," he said. He walked out of the service bay into the pre-dawn dark, and the sound of his boots on the concrete faded, and then the door closed, and Adeline stood alone beside the burgundy Venturi Speciale and listened to the silence the engine had left behind. It was 3:57 in the morning. In about 2 hours, Noah Whitaker would wake up in the apartment above a 2-bay repair shop on the other side of the city, come to find his father, and discover that the cereal situation was unchanged. And the engine that everyone said couldn't be fixed would sit quietly in Bay 1, waiting for Friday, having been fixed in the dark by someone nobody in that building had thought to ask, until they had absolutely no one else left to call. Caleb got home at 4:20 in the morning. He didn't take the stairs quietly, he never did, because the 3rd step from the bottom had a creak that was going to outlast the building, and there was no point pretending otherwise. But Noah didn't wake up. 6-year-olds sleep with the absolute commitment of people who have no concept of tomorrow being complicated. And Caleb stood in the doorway of the small bedroom for a moment, looking at his son in the dark before going to wash the grease off his arms in the bathroom where the water still took 3 minutes to get warm. He stood at the sink and let the water run and looked at himself in the mirror with the particular vacancy of someone who is too tired to have a reaction to anything. The engine had started. He'd known it would, once he found the plate. That wasn't arrogance. It was just the difference between uncertainty and certainty. And he'd crossed from one to the other the moment he understood what the previous technicians had disturbed without knowing it. What he hadn't expected was the sound. He'd heard Venturi modified engines in recordings and technical demonstrations years ago in a different life, but he hadn't been in a room with one running since before Elena died, and the particular voice of that V12 at 3:57 in the morning in an empty service bay had done something to him that he was not going to examine too carefully while standing at a bathroom sink at 4:20 on a Friday. He dried his hands, went to bed, set the alarm for 6:15 out of pure habit, and lay in the dark staring at the ceiling for about 11 minutes before he was gone. The alarm went off exactly as scheduled. Because alarms have no interest in your circumstances. Was already at the table when Caleb got to the kitchen, eating the oat cereal, with the methodical resignation of someone working through an obligation. "You were gone," Noah said. "I came back late. You were asleep. I woke up at—" Noah considered this. "A lot of night. And you were gone. I was working." "On what?" Caleb poured coffee. "Someone's engine. A special one." Noah processed this with the seriousness he brought to information he considered significant. "Did you fix it?" "Yeah." Noah nodded, apparently satisfied. He went back to the cereal. "Then, was it more special than Mr. Delgado's truck?" Mr. Delgado's truck was a 1987 F-150 that had been in and out of the shop for 8 months and had become, his estimation, a kind of recurring character in their lives. "Different kind of special," Caleb said. "More or less?" Caleb said. "By a lot." Noah considered this seriously. He said. Caleb drank his coffee standing at the counter and looked out the kitchen window at the alley where Mrs. Pacheco's mop had already appeared on its hook, right on schedule, marking the morning the same way it always did. The ordinary world going about its business. He had been awake for most of the night, saving a 50-year-old Italian engine for a Billionaire's Friday exhibition. And now he was standing in his kitchen, watching a mop dry, and somehow both of these things were equally real. He drove Noah to school, came back, opened the shop at 7, because that was when the shop opened, and there was a Honda Accord waiting for him with a clutch issue and a Dodge pickup with an alignment problem that wasn't going to solve itself, and the Silverado still needed its fuel pump confirmed before the owner came to pick it up on Saturday. He didn't think about Crestmont. Or he tried not to, which is a different thing. What he actually thought about, in the gaps between tasks while his hands were busy, and his mind had space to wander, without permission, was Alessandro Venturi. Specifically, he thought about the thing he'd told Adeline Carrington at midnight in that service bay about Venturi's training, about the way the man had understood engines as instruments, rather than machines. It was the first time Caleb had said any of that out loud to another person, in, he calculated, roughly 5 years. Maybe 6. Since the last conference he'd attended before everything changed, where he'd presented the early draft of the research to a small room of specialists who had received it with a particular combination of interest and skepticism that academics deploy when they encounter an argument they can't immediately dismiss. He hadn't finished it. After that, there hadn't been time, and then there hadn't been will, and then enough time had passed that finishing it felt like trying to resume a conversation that had moved on without him. He replaced the Accord's clutch and moved on to the pickup's alignment without resolving any of this. That afternoon, Claire called. He almost didn't answer. Unrecognized numbers got sent to voicemail as a general policy, but something made him pick up, some instinct he couldn't have articulated. "Mr. Whitaker, this is Claire Ashford. I'm Miss Carrington's assistant." "Yes," he intervened. "She asked me to confirm that the vehicle performed correctly this morning during the pre-exhibition check." "It performed correctly," Caleb said. "Good. She also wanted me to let you know that your invoice can be submitted to our accounts department directly, or if you prefer, you can send it to my email." Claire gave the address. "And she asked me to tell you." A slight pause, the kind that means the person is reading something rather than saying it from memory. "That she's grateful." Her word. "Okay," Caleb said. "Is there anything else you need from us?" He thought about this. He said, "I think we're good." He submitted the invoice that evening after Noah went to sleep. He spent longer on it than he should have, not because the numbers were complicated, but because he found himself uncertain about what the night was actually worth, in terms he could translate into a billing rate. His standard hourly was his standard hourly. The materials were what they were. The time was the time. He totaled it up, looked at the number for a moment, and sent it. The response came 2 days later, on Sunday afternoon, in the form of a bank notification. The amount deposited was 3 times what he'd invoiced. He sat with his phone in his hand and looked at the number for a while. V was in the backyard, such as it was, a narrow strip of concrete between the building and the back fence where Caleb had put a second-hand basketball hoop, attempting to teach himself how to dribble with mixed results. The ball careening off his sneakers and ricocheting against the fence with reliable irregularity. Caleb could hear it from where he was sitting at the workbench. Thud, crack, thud, crack, thud, pause, crack. He thought about calling Crestmont to tell them the payment was incorrect. He got as far as finding the number before he stopped and thought about what that conversation would actually sound like and decided against it. He put the phone down. He went outside and tried to show Noah how to keep the ball closer to his hand when he dribbled, which briefly, and then stopped working, and they spent 20 minutes on it before giving up and going inside for dinner. He didn't talk about the payment. There was no one to talk to about it, which was one of the stranger features of being the person he had become. Things happened that were significant enough to warrant discussion. And the people you'd talk to about them were gone, or far away, or 6 years old. He made pasta. Noah ate it without complaint, which was a reasonable Thursday. The exhibition, meanwhile, had gone the way exhibitions go, when everything works the way it's supposed to. The Venturi Speciale had stood at the center of Crestmont's main floor, under carefully calibrated lighting, its burgundy paint catching the beams at an angle that made it look less like a car and more like an artifact, which is, in a sense, what it was. Arthur Pembroke had arrived with a small entourage, had circled the car with the proprietary tenderness of a collector, reuniting with something he'd been afraid he'd lost, and had stood for a long moment with his hands in his pockets, simply looking at it, before turning to Adeline. "Tell me how," he'd said. Adeline had considered in the half-second before she answered the various ways she could frame the story. She was good at framing. She'd had years of practice making things sound the way they needed to sound for the person who was listening. It was a skill she'd developed the way most people develop skills, out of necessity, repeatedly until it became automatic. She said a specialist came in Thursday night. He found a damaged isolation plate in the fuel assembly, fabricated a replacement, and rebuilt the fuel system by hand. The engine ran at 3:50 in the morning. "Your in-house team?" Arthur asked. Adeline said external. A man named Caleb Whitaker. Arthur turned to look at her fully. "Whitaker," he said. "Caleb Whitaker. You know the name." "I know the research." Arthur said it the way you say something that surprises you in retrospect, not that you're surprised, but that you should have expected to be surprised and weren't. He published a draft analysis of Venturi's methodology, must be 8-9 years ago now. I had a copy of it for about 3 years before someone borrowed it, and it never came back. I've tried to track down another copy twice. He looked at the car. "He's still working in the field?" "He operates a small repair shop," Adeline said. Arthur was quiet for a moment. "A repair shop," he said. 2 bays. Something moved in Arthur Pembroke's face that Adeline didn't have an immediate name for. Not pity, not exactly, but the close relative of it that looks outward rather than down. "That seems like a significant mismatch," he said. Adeline thought about Caleb standing in the service bay at 4 in the morning with his canvas bag and his leather notebook, working on an engine that wasn't his problem by any obligation she had a right to claim on him. She thought about a 6-year-old asleep on a stool in a garage, with a red toolbox on the floor beside him. "I think it was a choice," she said. Arthur nodded slowly. "I'd like to speak with him, if that's possible. I can pass the message." "Please do." What Adeline did not tell Arthur, what she had also not told Claire, or anyone else, was that she had dealt with Bryce that same Friday morning, before the exhibition opened, in a meeting that lasted 12 minutes and went directions she hadn't fully planned going. She'd called him into her office at 7:30, before staff arrived in numbers, and she'd laid out what had happened Thursday night with the same directness she brought to everything. Bryce had listened with the expression of someone who already knew what was coming and was deciding how to respond to it. "The technician you dismissed at the parts counter," Adeline said, "was the person who fixed the engine your department declared unfixable." "I didn't dismiss Bryce." She said it flatly. "I was on the mezzanine." He stopped. "I watched the whole thing, including what you said to his son. Whatever Bryce had prepared to say, that detail apparently hadn't been in his calculation." He went quiet in a different way than before. "I'm removing you from the technical director position," Adeline said. "Effective today. You'll move to senior technician status, which means you're on the floor, not managing the floor. Your pay changes accordingly. If that's not acceptable to you, I'll understand, and we can discuss a separation package instead." "Adeline, I'm not angry with you," she said. "I want to be clear about that. I'm making a structural decision based on a pattern, and Wednesday was the most recent example of the pattern. If you stay as a technician. You're good at the technical work. I've always said that. Bryce sat with this for a moment. She could see him working through it, the pride and the arithmetic both, the question of which one he could afford to let win. Senior technician, he said. Not junior. Junior, another silence. Fine, he said. I'll stay, Adeline said. That's all. She meant it when she said she wasn't angry. Anger would have been simpler. What she felt instead was something complicated in form of accountability that extended its past Bryce to the moment on the mezzanine when she'd watched a child tell a man what his father did for a living and had turned around and gone back to her office. She'd addressed Bryce. She hadn't yet fully addressed the other part, and she wasn't sure that part could be addressed in a 12-minute meeting. It turned out Arthur passed Caleb's message along himself. He found the address through the same business registration records Claire had used, and he appeared at Whitaker Auto Works on the following Tuesday, without calling ahead, which was for a man of Arthur Pembroke's resources and habits, either an oversight or a deliberate choice to meet someone on terms that didn't feel like a summons. Caleb was under the Silverado when he heard someone come in the side door and stand there. He rolled out from under the truck and looked up at a man he didn't immediately recognize, mid-60s, well-dressed in the way that doesn't announce itself, white hair, the kind of physical presence that comes from decades of occupying rooms with a certain expectation. Mr. Whitaker, the man said. Caleb stood up. Yeah. Arthur Pembroke. The Venturi Speciale is mine. Caleb looked at him for a moment. He had the grease rag in his hand, and he didn't know what to do with it, which was briefly funny, which he contained. Who you are, he said. Good, Arthur said. Saves time. He looked around the shop with the interested attention of someone visiting a place they hadn't expected to find themselves. Not condescension, just genuine orientation. You mind if I... He gestured at a shop stool near the workbench. Go ahead. Arthur sat on the stool. Caleb leaned against the truck. I heard the car run, Arthur said. Friday evening in the showroom. I had them start it for me privately. The acoustics in that space are wrong for it. Too much glass. But even so. He paused. You understand what you heard, that engine, in that building at 4 in the morning, before anyone else arrived. What it would sound like at full rev on an open road with the right acoustics around it. It wasn't a question exactly, but Caleb answered it. He said. I have some idea. Then you understand why I've spent 11 years making sure that car is preserved correctly. Arthur said it without drama, just as a statement of proportion. When Adeline called me and told me what happened Thursday night, she gave me your name. I went home and spent 3 hours trying to find my copy of your research draft. I'd mislaid it. Eventually, I found the citation from the Munich paper, which has the abstract. He looked at Caleb directly. Why did you stop? Caleb turned the grease rag over in his hands. Personal circumstances. Same thing you told Adeline, I imagine. She told you that. She told me you said it. Not what it meant, Arthur paused. You don't have to tell me what it meant either, but I'll tell you what I'd like to offer, and then you can tell me to leave, and I'll leave without making it complicated. Caleb nodded once. I have 4 other vehicles requiring restoration and specialist attention over the next 2 years, Arthur said. 2 Venturis different years, different modification sets, and 2 others that require the kind of engineering understanding that I've been struggling to find someone I trust to bring to them. I'd like to engage you for that work. Your terms, your timeline, your shop, or another location if you prefer. I'm not asking you to rejoin any industry or change how you operate. I'm asking you if you want the work. The garage was quiet, except for the radio always kept low in the background. Some station playing something instrumental that neither of them was listening to was at school. The shop had the particular quality it had in the quiet mid-morning hours before anything needed to happen, when the light came in at a low angle through the upper windows and the dust hung in it in the way that made the place look almost atmospheric rather than just dusty. I'd have to think about it, Caleb said. That's the right answer, Arthur said. If you'd said yes immediately, I'd have been slightly concerned. He stood from the stool. He was taller standing than Caleb had registered. I'll give you my direct contact. No deadline. I've been waiting 11 years to have the right person on these cars. A few more weeks won't matter. He produced actual cardstock, not digital, which Caleb noted and set it on the workbench. The Munich paper, Caleb said. Arthur paused. The citation from the Munich paper. What was the specific point they referenced? Arthur looked at him. Something in his expression shifted in a way that suggested he was recalibrating slightly. The section on harmonic displacement in the intake architecture, he said. The argument that Venturi's resonance chambers weren't compensating for vibration, so much as using it as a load distribution mechanism. Caleb was quiet for a moment. That section was incomplete, he said. The version I circulated. I'd worked out the rest of it in my notes, but hadn't finished writing it. Did you ever finish it?
Perfect.
Arthur looked at the workbench, at the leather notebook that was sitting in its usual spot beside the lamp. Then he looked back at Caleb with the careful courtesy of someone who understands when not to press. Struck it. I hope you finish it someday, he said. For selfish reasons. I'd like to read it. He left, without making it into anything it didn't need to be, which Caleb appreciated more than he would have said. He stood in the shop after the door closed and looked at the card on the workbench for a while. He picked up the leather notebook and turned to the section on harmonic displacement and found the place where he'd stopped writing and looked at the last line he'd put down. Years ago, in different handwriting than he used now, tighter, faster. The handwriting of someone who expected to come back to it the next day. He didn't add anything. He closed the notebook and put it back. He got back under the Silverado. The fuel pump was confirmed by noon, and the truck's owner came for it that afternoon, a retired postal worker named Dale, who had been bringing his vehicles to Caleb for 3 years, and who always paid in cash and always stood in the doorway, talking for slightly longer than either of them strictly needed, which Caleb had come to understand was less about the trucks and more about having somewhere to stand for a while. Running good? Dale asked. Running fine, Caleb had said. Should have done it 6 weeks ago, but it's done now. Dale nodded, doing the thing he always did where he looked at the truck like it had let him down personally. It's an old truck, he said, which was his way of forgiving it. It's a good old truck, Caleb said, which was true. Dale paid and took the truck and stood in the driveway for a moment before getting in the way older men do with things they've had a long time, a moment of contact, palm on the hood, brief and almost unconscious. Then he got in and drove away. Caleb watched the truck go. He thought about Arthur Pembroke's card on the workbench. He thought about 2 Venturi modified engines with different modification sets, and what the differences in sets would mean technically, and what questions would need to be answered before he could responsibly touch either one. He was still thinking about this when he drove to pick up Noah from school at 3, because thinking is like that. It doesn't stop because the context changes. It just continues in the background while the rest of your life happens around it. Got in the car with his backpack and his lunchbox, and the particular energy of a 6-year-old at the end of a school day, which is the energy of a rubber band that has been stretched since morning and is now released without a clear target. Can we get the colored cereal? Noah says before he'd fully closed the door. It's Tuesday, so cereal is a weekend thing. That's not a rule. It's a guideline. Noah thought about this distinction with visible skepticism. What's the difference? A rule you can't argue with. A guideline you can argue with, but I still probably won't change. Absorb this. That doesn't seem fair. I know, Caleb said. A lot of things don't. Noah looked out the window at the passing street with the expression he wore when he was deciding whether to push further or let something go. He let it go, which was growth, Caleb noted privately. 6 months ago, the serial conversation would have run another 4 exchanges at minimum. Said after a block or two. Yeah. Did you fix the special engine? Caleb glanced at him. He'd mentioned it only in passing days ago, the morning after. He hadn't expected Noah to carry it. Yeah, he said. I did. Was it hard? Yeah, it was hard. Noah nodded, taking this in with the seriousness he gave to things he considered important. But you did it. But I did it. Another block of silence. I told Tyler, Noah said. Tyler, your friend from school? Tyler said his dad fixes stuff too. His dad fixed their dryer. That's good. I told him you fixed a car that 6 other guys couldn't fix. Noah said it with the casual factualness of someone reporting a score. Bragging. Just setting a record straight. He didn't really believe me. That's okay, Caleb said. I know. Noah said. It's still true. He said it the same way he'd told Bryce Langford at the parts counter that his dad fixed real engines with the simple, undramatic confidence of a child who hasn't yet learned that truth requires an audience to be valid. It landed in the car the same way it had landed in that marble-floored parts counter. And Caleb felt it the same ways, not in his chest exactly, but somewhere adjacent to it, place where things go when they matter too much for a normal reaction. He drove the rest of the way, in comfortable quiet. Noah, watching the city, scrolled past the window with the undemanding attentiveness of someone who finds ordinary things sufficient, and Caleb let himself do the same thing for a while, without deciding anything. He hadn't called Adeline back about Arthur's visit. She'd sent a text that said simply, "Arthur is planning to reach out. His intentions are genuine." For what that's worth. He hadn't responded yet. He wasn't sure what he wanted to say. What he knew with the specificity that comes from having learned something the hard way was that the question wasn't whether he could do the work. The question was never that. The work was the part he understood. He'd understood intervened. He'd understood it at 32, the same way he'd understood it at 26, the same way he'd understood it at 4 in the morning in an empty service bays, a stethoscope and a leather notebook and no one watching. That didn't go away. The question was what doing the work would cost, and who would be paying that price, and whether the person paying it was old enough to consent. Was pointing at something out the window, a dog, a large yellow one being walked by a small woman in a red coat, straining at its leash with tremendous optimism. Noah said. Caleb looked. That dog thinks it's going somewhere great, Noah said. Maybe it is, Caleb said. Maybe, Noah said, with the philosophical openness of someone who finds both outcomes equally interesting. They pulled into the alley behind the shop. Caleb parked. They went upstairs. He made something with eggs because the pasta situation from 3 days ago had run its course, and the grocery situation required weekend attention. And Noah sat at the table with his red toolbox open on the chair beside him, sorting through the plastic wrenches with the focused attention he always gave them. Inventory and arrangement, everything in its place. Caleb watched him while the eggs cooked. Arthur's card was still on the workbench downstairs. The leather notebook was still in its spot beside the lamp. The last line he'd written in the harmonic displacement section was still unfinished, waiting with the patience of words that don't have anywhere else to be. He turned the eggs. He called Noah to eat. They ate. Arthur's card sat on the workbench for 9 days. Caleb wasn't ignoring it, exactly. He knew where it was. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a sound you can't quite place, present in the peripheral attention without demanding the center of it. He moved around it when he worked. He set things next to it. Once he put a coffee mug on top of it by accident and didn't move the mug for 2 hours. And when he finally did, the card was still there, slightly warped from the heat. Arthur Pembroke's name in small, clean type that looked like it had been set by someone who understood that restraint is its own form of statement. The 9 days were not uneventful. The Accord came back with a new complaint, a rattle in the dash, that turned out to be a loose bracket rather than anything serious, which the owner received as if Caleb had delivered very good news about a medical test. A new customer brought in a vintage Alfa Romeo with an electrical issue that had defeated 2 other mechanics, and which turned out, after 2 full afternoons and 1 moment of genuine frustration, where Caleb stood back from the car and said something he was glad Noah wasn't there to hear, to be a grounding issue so elementary that its elusiveness was almost insulting. He fixed it. He charged fairly. The customer, a retired architect named Mr. Voss, who had the slightly manic energy of someone who had loved Italian cars their entire life and was not willing to give up on them now, shook Caleb's hand with both of his and said, "You're the real thing. You that?" Caleb said thank you and meant it in a moderate way. Had a school project about habitats that required the construction of a diorama. The week contained the particular drama of parents and children everywhere who attempt crafts together without adequate preparation, the trip to the dollar store for materials, the discovery that the right shade of blue paint was not available, the substitution of the wrong shade of blue paint, Noah's verdict that it looked wrong, Caleb's measured disagreement, a compromise that satisfied neither of them fully, but which they both agreed was good enough, and the finished diorama sitting on the kitchen table on Thursday evening with its small plastic animals arranged styrofoam, if not exactly natural, at least committed. "You think it's okay?" Noah asked, studying it. "I think it's fine," Caleb said. "Tyler's mom made his. How do you know?" Because Tyler said his mom made it and it has real moss. Caleb looked at the diorama. It did not have real moss. It had the wrong shade of blue paint and a painted-on approximation of grass, and a cotton ball cloud situation that had been Noah's idea, and which Caleb had not discouraged. Real moss is impressive, he said carefully. Is ours okay? Ours is ours, Caleb said. Noah considered this for a moment, turning it over the way he did with things he wasn't sure were answers or deflections. Okay, he said finally, with the provisional acceptance of someone filing something away for later review. It was the Friday of the 9th day, 9 days. After Arthur Pembroke had sat on a stool and left his card with the quiet weight of an offer that didn't need pressure to be felt, that Adeline came back to the shop. To the park 3 blocks from it, which she couldn't have known, was where Caleb took Noah on Friday afternoons when the weather allowed, unless she'd asked someone, which he suspected was exactly what had happened. She was sitting on a bench near the south entrance when they arrived, dressed in clothes that were not her business clothes, but which still looked like they'd been chosen by someone who thought about things. A gray coat, dark jeans, her hair down in a way that made her look slightly less like a person in a meeting. She stood when she saw them. Noah saw her first, because Noah always saw everything. First, he had his mother's peripheral awareness, that slight animal attentiveness that registered the environment continuously rather than scanning it in passes. He looked at her, then up at Caleb, then back at her. That's the lady from your work, Noah said, with the uncanny accuracy of children who remember faces attached to emotions. Yeah, Caleb said. Adeline walked toward them. She stopped a reasonable distance, which Caleb noticed and credited to her not crowding the approach, letting him set the terms of the distance. I hope this is all right, she said. You could have called, he said. I thought about it. She paused. I wanted to talk in person. I can leave if the timing is wrong. Was already drifting toward the play structure 20 feet away, the specific gravitational pull of monkey bars, overriding any interest in adult conversation. He still had the red toolbox, which he'd insisted on bringing. It sat on the ground at the base of the structure, while he climbed, watching over it from above, like a small sentry. Caleb looked at Adeline. What did you want to say? She didn't immediately say it. She turned and looked at the park, at the trees that were turning, October having finally committed to its seasonal obligations, and at Noah on the monkey bars making progress with the methodical determination he brought to physical challenges, and at the other people moving through space with their dogs and their children and their ordinary Friday afternoon arrangements. Arthur told me he came to see you, she said. He mentioned he would. He also told me what he offered, the broad outline. She looked at Caleb. I'm not here about that. Okay, I'm here because... She stopped, started again, and the restart was slightly different in tone, less prepared, which he thought was more accurate to whatever she was actually trying to say. I've been thinking about Wednesday, the parts counter. I told you I should have come down, and I didn't. And you were decent about it, and I said what I said, and then we moved on to the engine, and the engine got fixed, and the exhibition happened, and I paid the invoice, and everything proceeded. But I've been another pause. I've been sitting with it. Caleb waited. I'm good at moving forward, Adeline said. I'm very good at it. It's one of the things I'm most efficient at, honestly. Something happens. I process it. I address what can be addressed. I file the rest and move on. That's gotten me most of the things I have. And I was doing that with this. Filing it. She looked at the ground for a moment, then back up. The problem is that I keep taking it back out of the file. Caleb was quiet for a moment. Yes. Across the park, Noah had it across the monkey bars and was now regarding the red toolbox with the expression of someone deciding whether it needs to come up the slide or stay at the bottom. He decided to leave it. He went up the slide ladder. What are you wanting from me? Caleb asked. Not unkindly, just directly, because he was a direct person when the situation called for it, and he didn't think being unclear about what they were talking about served either of them. Adeline looked at him. Something in her face shifted in a way that might have been discomfort, or might have been the more specific thing that looks like discomfort when someone says out loud what they usually keep internal. I'm not sure, she said. I think I just wanted to say it clearly. Without the engine and the deadline, and the context of me needing something from you. I saw what happened. I didn't act. And I don't want to be the kind of person who files that away and moves on. She paused. Yet, even if I'm already pretty good at being that person. Caleb looked at her for a long moment. He thought about what it cost a person like Adeline Carrington, a person who had built precision into a professional philosophy for whom the appearance of competence was also actual competence. And losing either was a kind of structural failure, to sit on a park bench and say that she was bothered by something she'd done and wasn't sure what she wanted from the conversation. He thought it probably cost more than she made it look. My wife used to say, he said, and then he stopped. Because he hadn't planned to start that sentence, and now that it was started, he wasn't entirely sure he wanted to finish it. He'd gotten careless with the silence. He tried again. She used to say that the difference between a person who hurts you and a person who matters isn't whether they hurt you. It's what they do with it after. He looked toward Noah. I don't know if I believe that completely, but I think there's something in it. Adeline was very still. I'm not angry about the parts counter, he said. I wasn't then either. It wasn't the first time. He said it without self-pity, as a simple calibration of scale. What you said when you came to the garage, that was enough. You didn't have to say it. You did. That's a lower bar than it should be, Adeline said. He said is. But it's where the bar is. They were quiet for a moment. A dog ran past, pursuing something it would not catch, its owner following with the resigned energy of someone who has accepted that this is now their afternoon. Shouted something from the top of the slide, Dad. Watch! And Caleb turned and watched him come down, a brief controlled chaos of small limbs and momentum that ended with Noah landing on his feet and looking up for confirmation. Good, Caleb called. Noah grinned and went back around to the ladder. He looks like you, Adeline said, around the eyes. He looks like his mother, Caleb said, around everything else. She didn't ask about Elena. He appreciated that. I've been thinking about something else, Adeline said after a moment that felt like it was deciding what to be. About the work, what Arthur offered, and what that would mean practically. For me, for you. I know it's not my business. You can say it. The work would bring him to your shop, or require you to work at other locations. It's not the kind of engagement that stays predictable. With Pembroke, he's a man who finds one interest and then finds 6 more interests adjacent to it. If you take the first job, there will be more. I know that. And you have... She glanced toward the play structure, at Noah, who was now attempting the monkey bars again from the opposite direction. Constraints on your time that are non-negotiable. They are, Caleb said. Then whatever you decide, it should probably have terms attached to it. Just yours terms you make him agree to in writing. Hours, notice. The conditions under which you can stop without obligation. She said it with the practical fluency of someone who had negotiated things before and knew which parts mattered. Arthur is a good man. He's also a man who is used to getting what he wants, and when someone is very good at their work, the people who want that work have a habit of expanding the scope of what they're asking for. Slowly, without anyone making an explicit decision about it. Caleb looked at her. You're telling me how to negotiate with your client, he said. I'm telling you how to protect yourself from a dynamic I've watched happen to other people, she said. He's my client. He's also your potential situation. They're different things, and I can hold both. He thought about this. Why? She looked at him with the expression of someone who has considered this question before arriving at the park. Because I walked away from a bench on a mezzanine when I should have walked down a flight of stairs, she said. And I'm not under any illusion that one conversation makes up for that. But I can be useful to you in ways that cost me nothing, and it seems like the least complicated option. It was, Caleb thought, possibly the most honest and least sentimental description of attempted restitution he'd ever heard. He didn't know whether to find it admirable or slightly clinical, and he supposed the answer was probably both. All right, he said. She looked at him. All right, you'll think about it, or all right, you'll take the advice, he said. Probably. The afternoon was doing what late October afternoons do, getting ahead of itself, the light dropping faster than you expect, the temperature following with the sudden resolve of weather that has been mild too long and is now making up for it. Caleb could feel the chill coming into the air, the kind that made kids on playground Venturi equipment stop noticing, and adults start thinking about coats they didn't bring. He called to Noah, who came with the specific reluctance of someone not yet finished with what they were doing but mature enough, barely not to argue about it. He picked up the red toolbox from the base of the play structure and carried it with both hands the way he always did, seriously, like it weighed more than it did. He stopped when he saw Adeline standing with his father. He looked at her with the directness he'd looked at her with at the parts counter. "Are you the one who has the special car?" he asked. Adeline looked at Caleb briefly, then back at Noah. "The car belongs to a friend of mine," she said. "But yes, your dad fixed it at my shop. Absorb this. Dad said it was the most special car. More special than Mr. Delgado's truck." "Your dad is right," Adeline said. Seemed satisfied with this, the confirmation from an outside source carrying the authority of independent verification. He looked at the toolbox in his hands, then up at Adeline. "What a torque wrench is?" he asked. Adeline, to her credit, did not smile in the way that adults smile at children when they're being condescended to while trying not to show it. She considered the question as if it were a reasonable one, which it was. "What it does," she said. "Not how to use one." "Dad knows," Noah said. "I know," Adeline said. Accepted this and turned to Caleb. "Can we get food?" "We have food at home. The hot kind from the place. The place is closed on Fridays." "No, it isn't. You're right," Caleb said. "I was thinking of the other place." But Noah looked at him with the expression of someone who suspects they've just won something but isn't sure how to verify it. "So we can go? We'll see." They walked toward the park exit. Adeline walked with them to the gate, which was the natural end of the conversation, and stopped there. Caleb stopped too. "Call Arthur," she said, "before the end of next week. He's patient, but he'll assume silence means no." "Is that advice or information?" "Both," she said. "Probably." He recognized the echo, and something in him acknowledged it briefly, the small calibration of two people, finding the edges of a common language. "I'll call him," he said. She nodded. She looked at Noah, who was already 3 steps ahead examining something on the gatepost with the intensity he brought to objects that interested him. "He's a good kid," she said. "I know," Caleb said. "He meant it the way you mean things that are so true they've moved past gratitude into fact." He called Arthur Pembroke on the following Wednesday morning, standing at his workbench before the shop opened, with the coffee going and the radio off, because he wanted to be able to think clearly. Arthur picked up on the second ring. "I was wondering when you'd call," Arthur said, which was either prescience or the confidence of a man who knew his offers were good ones. "I have conditions," Caleb said. "I'd expect nothing less." "Tell me." Caleb had written them out the night before, on the back of an invoice form, because it was the paper nearest to hand, in the specific handwriting he used when he was thinking and not performing thought. He read them out. Hours per engagement capped, scheduled around school hours, and never on the days Noah had anything. Travel requirements, longer than 1 day, without 2 weeks minimum notice. Right to pause any project without penalty if a personal emergency required it. All scope agreed in writing before any work commenced. Payment in advance for materials. Arthur was quiet for a moment after the last one. "The advance payment," he said. "Is that about cash flow, or is it about commitment?" Caleb had thought about how to answer this. "Both," he said. "If someone's paid for the materials, they've decided they actually want the work done. It clears up ambiguity." "Fair," Arthur said. "I'll have my attorney draw up the agreement with those terms." "You should have your own attorney review it." "I don't have an attorney." "Get one," Arthur said. "For this you should. I can recommend someone who won't charge you more than the job warrants." Caleb wrote down the name Arthur gave him. "When would you want to start?" Arthur asked. "After I've seen the agreement, and after my attorneys looked at it," Caleb said. 3 weeks, maybe 4. "Fine," Arthur said. "The first car is the 1968 Venturi. It needs a complete assessment before we discuss restoration scope. I'll have it delivered to your shop whenever you're ready." Caleb stopped. "Delivered here? You said your shop. Was that not—" He looked around the 2-bay space, at the Honda in Bay 1 and the empty Bay 2 with its concrete floor and its fluorescent light that buzzed slightly on cold mornings. At the parts shelf and the rolling cabinet and the wooden stool in the corner where Noah sat. "That works," he said. "Yeah, that works." After he hung up, he stood at the workbench for a while without doing anything in particular. Outside on the street moved. Way cities move in the early morning. The delivery trucks, The people walking with coffee, the particular sound of a place warming up to the day it's going to be. He picked up the leather notebook. He opened it to the harmonic displacement section, to the last line he'd written years ago in the tighter, faster handwriting of a different version of himself. He read it. He thought about what came next, not in an abstract way, but specifically because he had in the last 9 days been thinking about it in the way he thought about mechanical problems, systematically and from different angles, and he knew what the next sentence was. He found a pen. He wrote it. It was one sentence, 22 words, and it connected the unfinished argument to the conclusion he'd been moving toward years ago when everything stopped. It wasn't the whole section. It wasn't even most of it. But it was the sentence, and the next sentence was the one that mattered, because you can't write the one after it until you've written that one. He closed the notebook. The buzzing fluorescent in Bay 2 needed replacing. He'd known this for 2 weeks and kept putting it off because the bulbs were an awkward size and required a specific trip to the hardware store, and he added it now to the mental list of the things the weekend needed to contain, alongside the grocery situation and the cereal that Noah had been campaigning for since Tuesday. He unlocked the shop door. He put the radio on. He got back to work. 3 weeks later, on a gray Thursday morning, with the kind of low sky that can't decide between rain and simply threatening it, a flatbed truck pulled up in front of Whitaker Auto Works carrying a covered vehicle that was clearly not from this decade or the one before it. The driver came in to confirm the delivery. Caleb signed for it. The driver operated the hydraulics, and the flatbed lowered, and they rolled the covered car off onto the street and then into Bay 2. Caleb had cleared and cleaned the previous evening with a thoroughness he applied to the space only when something significant was coming into it. He walked around it once, with the cover still on. Then he pulled the cover off. The 1968 Venturi sat there under the fluorescent light, the new one, since he'd finally replaced the bulb in a dark green that had gone complex with age, deep and a little uneven in the way that old paint gets when it's been through enough seasons. It was not pristine. There was surface oxidation along the driver's side rocker panel, and the rear fascia had a hairline crack that someone had attempted and not quite succeeded in repairing, and the interior through the glass looked like it had experienced the last 5 decades rather than been kept from them. It was, Caleb thought, exactly the right kind of problem. He stood with his hands in his pockets and looked at it for a long moment with the particular attention he'd been saving for this, the attention that has nowhere to land until the thing it's meant for is finally in front of it. Behind him, on the wooden stool in the corner, Noah sat with his red toolbox open on his plastic wrenches into the arrangement, sorting the plastic wrenches into the arrangement that made sense to him that particular morning, which was not the same arrangement he used every morning, but which always had its own logic. "Is that the one?" Noah asked. "That's the one," Caleb said. Studied the car from across the bay, with his child's unguarded appraisal. "It looks old," he said. "It is old. Is that bad?" Caleb looked at the oxidized rocker panel, at the attempted repair on the fascia, at the complexity of age that sat in the green paint like something that had been put there deliberately. He said, "Old just means it's been through things." Accepted this with the equanimity he was developing for information that didn't immediately resolve into an opinion. He went back to his wrenches. Caleb opened the leather notebook to the harmonic displacement section, and then opened Bay 2's hood with the methodical reverence of someone approaching something that requires getting right. The engine was there, waiting the way engines wait indifferent to what was made of them, entirely dependent on the person willing to understand them. Caleb picked up the stethoscope. He got to work. The assessment of the 968 Venturi took 11 days. 11 days of continuous work, 11 days, of the kind of work that happens in layers, where you look at something, then you look at your notes, then you look at something else. You go home and make dinner and help with homework, and put a child to bed, and lie awake for 20 minutes thinking about a specific measurement you took that afternoon, and whether it means what you think it means. Caleb had always worked this way on complex problems, in the gaps between everything else, which was either a professional methodology or just what it looked like, when a person had no choice but to fit their real work around the rest of their life. 1,000 968 had a different modification set than the Special, as Arthur had indicated, where the Special's Venturi modifications had focused primarily on the fuel assembly and resonance chambers. The 1968 showed the hallmarks of an earlier period in Venturi's, thinking the modifications were less integrated, more experimental, which meant the logic connecting them was harder to read and easier to damage accidentally. Someone in the car's history, probably in the late 80s, based on the type of intervention, had done exactly that. They'd replaced a component in the intake system with a standard factory part, probably because the original was damaged and they hadn't known better. And the substitution had introduced a vibration pattern into the engine that had over the subsequent decades, slowly loosened several other components in ways that were individually minor and collectively significant. It was, Caleb thought, a very good example of how ignorance compounds. Malice, just a person doing their best with the information they had, and the information being wrong, and the wrongness accumulating. He wrote this up in the assessment. He wrote it without editorializing, as a technical finding with historical context, because the person who'd made the substitution was probably dead, and certainly beyond accountability, and the point wasn't blame but understanding what had happened so you could responsibly undo it. He sent the assessment to Arthur on a Thursday afternoon, after Noah was in bed and the shop was quiet. He sent a copy to Adeline, because Arthur had asked him to include her in communications, because though he didn't examine this too carefully, he had found over the past few weeks that having another person read what he wrote before anyone acted on it was less uncomfortable than he'd expected it to be. Adeline responded within 40 minutes, which told him she hadn't been asleep. The intake analysis is very clear, she wrote. Arthur will have questions about the cost estimate for sourcing the original spec parts. The number you've given him is accurate, but he'll still ask. Discount it. Caleb read this twice. Then he wrote back, "Why would I discount it?" Her response, "Because you're not used to clients at this level, and the instinct when they push back is to move. The number is right." He put the phone down and thought about whether he was annoyed by this or whether it was useful. He decided it was mostly useful with a thin layer of annoyance, which seemed like an honest proportion. Arthur called the next morning and asked about the part's cost, and Caleb didn't move on the number, and Arthur said, "Good, that's reasonable," and moved on to the timeline, which suggested that Arthur had been testing the number less as he objected to it, and more because he wanted to know whether Caleb would hold it, and that Adeline had been right about this specific dynamic without being smug about it, which he felt for later consideration. The weeks that followed had a structure that was new and not entirely comfortable, and also in ways he was cautious about acknowledging necessary. The Venturi work occupied Bay 2 on its own schedule, some mornings entirely, some afternoons not at all, depending on what stage the restoration was at and what other work the shop needed. The regular clients continued to come. The Accord returned with a new issue, different from the previous ones, which Caleb was beginning to suspect meant the car was simply aging into a long relationship with the shop, rather than having fixable problems. Mr. Voss brought the Alfa Romeo back twice, both times for things that turned out to be straightforward. Both times accompanied by a 40-minute conversation about the history of Italian automotive engineering, in which Caleb participated more than he strictly needed to, but found he didn't mind. Turned 7 in November. The birthday had the particular weight that birthdays have when you're doing them alone as a parent. The planning, the cake, the managing of expectations upward and downward simultaneously. Had wanted a party with his school friends, and Caleb had organized one at the community center 2 blocks from the shop, and it had been the specific controlled chaos of children at a party where everything works approximately right, but not exactly right. And the cake was a little lopsided because Caleb had made it himself, and baking was not an area where his precision translated, and Noah had eaten 2 pieces and declared it the best cake he'd ever had, which Caleb suspected was the generosity of a child who understood more about his father's effort than he had words for. Adeline sent a card. It arrived 2 days after the birthday, addressed to Noah Whitaker in handwriting that Caleb recognized from the note she'd left on the invoice. Inside was a card with a picture of a car on it, not a toy car, an actual vintage car. tasteful and well-chosen, and a note that said, "Happy birthday, Noah. I hear you know your way around a toolbox." Below that, a gift card to a bookstore, which Caleb thought was either a lucky guess about what Noah liked or something she'd found out, and he wasn't entirely sure which. Looked at the card for a long time. "She knows my name," he said. "I told her," Caleb said. Noah processed this. "Why?" "Because," did she ask. "Because she—" Caleb stopped. Started again. "She wanted to send you something for your birthday. To do that, she needed your name." Noah accepted this chain of logic. He put the card carefully on his small shelf in his bedroom, between a drawing he'd made of the shop and a photograph of Elena that sat there in a frame that had been a gift from Caleb's mother, and which was slightly too large for the photo in a way that nobody had ever corrected. He put the birthday card next to the photograph with the specific intentionality of a child, placing something where it belongs. Caleb stood in the doorway and watched this and didn't say anything. The intake components for the 968 took 6 weeks to source, which was actually faster than Caleb had estimated Arthur's resources, accelerating a process that would have taken Caleb months on his own. 2 of the 3 original spec parts came from a private collection in the Netherlands that Arthur had a relationship with. The third required fabrication, which Caleb did himself in the shop over 4 evenings, working from the dimensional specifications in his notebook and checking each measurement against the 2 original parts he had for reference. He found during those 4 evenings that the fabrication work occupied a specific part of his attention that had been unoccupied for years, not the problem-solving part, which got regular exercise, but something more particular than that. Something closer to craftsmanship in its oldest sense, where the thing you're making requires you to be fully present to it. Or it will tell you so in the most unambiguous terms. Yes, he'd intervened. He'd missed it, without knowing he'd missed it, the way you don't notice the absence of something until it's back, and you feel the difference. He didn't tell anyone this. It wasn't the kind of thing that translated well into conversation. What he did tell Adeline, in a phone call that had started as a logistics question about delivery arrangements for the completed parts, and had drifted, the way phone calls do, into something adjacent, was that the third component was more complex than the original estimate had allowed for. "How much more complex?" she asked. "An additional 2 weeks, minimum. The dimensional tolerances are tighter than the other 2 because it's the load-bearing interface between the intake system and the resonance chamber. If I'm 1/10 off on the seating, the same compounding problem as the original substitution." "Does Arthur know?" "I'm telling him this afternoon." "Tell him before 2. He has something at 2 that puts him in a worse mood for the rest of the day." Caleb stopped. "How do you know his schedule?" "He's a client," she said. "His schedule, the way I know all my significant client schedules. It's not surveillance. It's just attention. Paying attention to people is part of the work." He thought about this. "Is that something you learned or something you've always done?" A pause that was slightly longer than logistics required. "I think," she said, "it started as a strategy. At some point it became a habit. And then at some point the habit became, I'm not sure. Genuine, maybe. I don't know exactly when it crossed over." It was, Caleb thought, a more honest answer than the question had necessarily required. He called Arthur before 2. Arthur received the delay with the equanimity of a man who has spent decades collecting objects that required patience, said, "If it needs 2 more weeks, give it 2 more weeks," and moved on. Adeline had been right about the timing. He added this to the running account he kept internally of the things she'd been right about, which was becoming a list of some length. December came without ceremony. The shop was cold in the mornings until the space heaters caught up, and Caleb bought Noah a heavier jacket because the one from last year had not survived the gap between October and November with its arms at a useful length. The city put up its seasonal decorations on the commercial street 2 blocks over, walked Caleb past them on a Saturday afternoon with the particular pride of a child presenting something to a parent, as if he had personally arranged the lights. "Those are the best ones," Noah said, pointing to a cluster of blue-white lights wound around a bare tree. "They're good," Caleb said. "Better than the other ones on the next block." Caleb looked at the next block's lights, which were a different color and which he didn't have a strong opinion about. "Different," he said. "Worse," Noah said firmly. Caleb didn't argue. over the 7 years of his son's life. That aesthetic conviction in a child is one of the things you don't productively challenge, partly because the conviction is genuine and partly because the child is frequently right. It was on this same Saturday walk that Noah said, without any particular preamble, "Is Adeline your friend?" Caleb kept walking for a step. "What made you think of that?" "The card," Noah said. "Send cards. People who aren't friends send cards too. Insurance companies. Banks." Noah looked at him with the expression he reserved for answers that technically responded to the question while clearly avoiding it. "She sent one with a car on it," he said, "and money for books. Banks don't do that." Caleb allowed this distinction. He thought about the word, about the park and the parts counter and the mezzanine in the middle of the night in a service bay and a phone call that had drifted past logistics. "We're figuring that out," he said. Noah seemed to find this acceptable. "Okay," he said. He looked at the blue-white lights again, satisfied. "Want hot chocolate? There's hot chocolate at home. The kind from the place that's closed on Fridays. It's Saturday." "You're right," Caleb said. "It's Saturday." They got hot chocolate from the place. The third component was finished on a Wednesday in the second week of December, and Caleb called Arthur to schedule the installation phase of the restoration, which would take another 3 weeks and would mark the midpoint of the overall project. Arthur came to the shop the following Friday to see the progress, which Caleb hadn't expected. He'd assumed Arthur would wait for reports and photographs, and which required Caleb to think briefly the state of the shop from the perspective of a man who was used to of a different order. The shop was what it was. He didn't clean it more than usual. Arthur arrived on time and walked into Bay 2 and stood looking at the 1,968 with his hands in his coat pockets. He'd dressed practically older clothes, boots, a coat that had seen weather. He looked at the car, the way he always looked at it, with the attention that had no performance in it. Just someone looking at something they cared about. "The color is original?" he asked. "Yes," Caleb said. "The oxidation on the rocker panel is surface level. There's no rust underneath. When we get to the bodywork phase, it can be addressed without repainting." "I don't want it repainted," Arthur said. "I want it as close to what it is as possible. Preserved, not restored to factory." "That's what I was going to recommend," Caleb said. Arthur looked at him. "Is it? A car at this point in its history, the age is the authenticity. If you take it back to factory condition, you lose 50 years of what it actually is. The oxidation pattern on the paint is part of its documentation." Arthur was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The German paper, the one that cited your research, there's a passage in it about the relationship between mechanical preservation and historical integrity. The author credits your framework for the argument." Caleb hadn't known that. The Munich paper, he knew it, cited the resonance analysis, but he hadn't read it completely. He'd read the sections relevant to his own work and stopped. "I'd like to read the rest of it," he said. "I'll send it to you," Arthur said. Came in from the apartment upstairs during this exchange, appearing in the doorway between the back room and the main bay in his socks and a shirt that was slightly too big for him, carrying the red toolbox. He stopped when he saw Arthur, ran a brief internal calculation, and kept walking to his stool in the corner with the composure of someone who has decided a new person is not a sufficient reason to change the plan. He opened the toolbox. He began sorting. Arthur watched this for a moment. "Your son," he said to Caleb. "He comes to the shop often?" "Every day," Caleb said. Arthur looked from Noah to the 1,968 Venturi and back, and something in his expression did the thing that Caleb had seen in several people's expressions over the past months. Not pity, not sentiment, but the recognition of a specific arrangement that had its own logic and its own kind of sense, even if it was unconventional. Arthur said, addressing him directly. Noah looked up from the toolbox. "Do you know what that car is?" Noah studied the 1,968 with the critical appraisal he gave to everything. "It's old," he said, "and it's green, and my dad is fixing it." "That's right," Arthur said. "It's about 55 years old. Considered this." "That's older than you," he told Caleb. "It is," Caleb agreed. "Is it older than Grandma?" Noah accepted the relative chronology and went back to the toolbox. Arthur looked at Caleb with something that wasn't quite a smile, but was in that territory, and Caleb looked back at him with the expression of a person who has long since stopped being surprised by his son and has arrived at a steady appreciation. They went over the technical details of the installation phase for about an hour. Arthur asked good questions, not expert questions, but the questions of someone who had educated themselves carefully in the subject they cared about, which was a different kind of knowledge, and in some ways more useful in a conversation like this one, because it meant he understood enough to follow the answers without requiring everything to be translated. When Arthur left, he stopped at the door and said, "I'm having a small gathering in January. Collectors, some engineers, a few people from the industry. I'd like you to come." Caleb looked at him. I know, Arthur said. That's why I'm asking. Everyone who regularly attends already knows everyone else. It gets repetitive. He paused. Bring Noah if you like. Several people bring children. Caleb said he'd think about it. Arthur nodded and left, and Caleb turned back to Bay 2 and the 1968 and the specific pleasures and demands of work that was going to require everything he had for the next several weeks. He thought about the gathering. He thought about walking into a room full of collectors and industry people as the person who ran a two-bay shop, who had declined to be any kind of person in this world for 8 years, come back into it sideways through a dead engine at 3 in the morning, and hadn't made any definitive decision since about what it meant or where it was going. He picked up the stethoscope. He placed it against the block at the first of 3 mute points established deceasable in the assessment. He listened. The engine had a different voice from the specifici, lower, rougher from the damage and the years, but underneath the roughness something that was structurally intact. The original intention, still audible if you knew what you were listening for. It was, Caleb had come to think over the 11 days of the assessment, an engine that had been badly treated not out of neglect, but out of not being understood, was a difference. Neglect was indifference. Not being understood was something else, a kind of loneliness. If you were willing to use that word about an engine, which Caleb usually wasn't but allowed himself in private. Behind him, Noah had finished with the toolbox and was now drawing something on the paper. He kept in the side pocket he'd started doing this in the shop, drawing the cars and the tools, and occasionally Caleb himself, rendered in the angular simplicity of a 7-year-old who has strong opinions about lines. Caleb didn't look. He knew from peripheral experience that being watched while drawing produced in Noah the same reaction it produced in most people who were doing something real. He listened to the engine. It was telling him something about the junction between the intake modification and the original block that he hadn't fully worked out yet. A resonance pattern that didn't match what the notes predicted. Yes, he'd intervened, which either meant the notes needed adjusting or something in the engine's history he hadn't found yet. The stethoscope. Listened again. There it was. A slight but consistent deviation at the secondary resonance point. He straightened up. He looked at the engine. He reached for the notebook and found a clean page and started writing quickly with the shorthand he'd developed over years for getting thoughts down before they moved. Said 1 second. He finished the notation. What? Can I have the colored cereal for dinner? Why? Because it's not food. It's a dessert that someone put in a breakfast-shaped box. Tyler has it for dinner. Tyler's parents make different choices than I do. Are their choices worse? Caleb considered this carefully. They're different, he said. That's what you said about the lights. I say it a lot, Caleb agreed. Because it's usually accurate. Made a sound that was the verbal equivalent of filing a complaint with no expectation of resolution. He went back to the drawing. Caleb went back to the notebook. Yes, he'd intervened. He wrote until the notation was complete, and then he read it back. And then he read the corresponding section in the original assessment, and he understood what he was looking at. The deviation wasn't from something in the engine's history he'd missed. It was from the original modification itself. Venturi, in 1968, had built in a small deliberate asymmetry to the resonance pattern that his later cars didn't have. It was a characteristic of the early period, of the experimental thinking that the 1968 represented. The engine wasn't damaged at this point. It was original. He sat with that for a while. There was something that happened in the body when you understood a thing you'd been trying to understand, not the relief of problem solved, but something closer to the satisfaction of a question answered, which is different because the question was more interesting than the answer, And the answer's view is mostly in completing the understanding, rather than ending the inquiry. He wrote it up properly. He added it to the assessment addendum. He sent it to Arthur that night with a note that said, "The secondary resonance deviation is original to the 1000 to the 1968 modification set, not damage. It's a feature of Venturi's early experimental period. I'll document it fully in the restoration record." Arthur's response came the next morning. "This is exactly why you were the right person for these cars." The other assessors I'd consulted missed it entirely. "Thank you, Caleb." Caleb read it at the workbench over his first coffee. He read it the way he read most things that said something direct and unguarded carefully, giving it a moment, not rushing past it. He put the phone down. He started the day. The shop opened. The Honda came in for its latest installment in what was becoming a long relationship. Mr. Voss called about a transmission question on the Alpha that Caleb answered in the parking lot while watching the street because the coffee was cooling and he needed air. A new customer arrived with a pickup truck that had a brake issue and an explanation of the brake issue that was longer and more elaborately incorrect than Caleb had time for. But he let the man finish and then said, "You have a look, because sometimes people need to be heard before they can be helped." And that was true of trucks as much as anything else. Was at school. The day moved in its ordinary way. In Bay 2, 1968, Venturi sat with its hood open, waiting with the patience of things that have already waited a long time for one person to understand them. The new fluorescent light was steady above it. The stethoscope was on the workbench beside the notebook. Caleb's most recent annotation was on the page, facing the last line he'd written years ago, the one that had waited unfinished until he could finally find the sentence after it. He'd intervened. He hadn't shown anyone the notebook since Elena. He thought about that sometimes, in the way you think about the things you're holding that you haven't examined recently, checking whether the weight has changed. It had changed, though he wasn't ready to characterize how. Something had shifted in the past 2 months that he hadn't asked to shift, and hadn't resisted, and couldn't fully account for. The world that had been very small for 8 years had become, without his making any single definitive decision, slightly larger. He wasn't sure yet what to do with that. He picked up the brake job. He put his hands where they needed to be. He worked. Arthur's January gathering was held at his house, which was not a word that adequately described the building, but was the word Arthur used. Yes, he'd intervened, and Caleb had decided to take him at his word rather than prepare himself for something he couldn't prepared for anyway. It was the second Saturday of January, cold but dry, the kind of winter evening where the air had a quality to it that made distances look sharper than they actually were. Caleb drove with Noah in the passenger seat wearing his good sweater, the dark blue one that Elena's mother had given him 2 birthdays ago and which still fit, red tool bucks on his lap because Noah had asked if he could bring it, and Caleb had said yes without thinking about whether it was appropriate, and then thought about it, decided that if it wasn't appropriate, then the gathering was probably the wrong gathering for them anyway. "Is it a party?" Noah asked. "It's a gathering," Caleb said. "What's the difference?" "Fewer balloons. More people standing and talking." Absorb this. Do I have to talk to people? If you don't want to. What if they talk to me? Then you answer. You don't have to say much. Yes, no, and I don't know cover most situations. Tested these responses silently, mouthing them like vocabulary words. What if they ask something dumb? You still answer politely. Even if it's really dumb? Especially then, Caleb said. That's most of social life. Arthur's house, the building, the estate, whatever the accurate word was, sat at the end of a private road that Caleb's GPS found reluctantly. When they came around the last bend and it appeared in the headlights, went quiet for a moment, in the way children go quiet when something exceeds their existing frame of reference. "It's big," Noah said. "It is," Caleb said. "Are we allowed to go in?" "We're invited," Caleb said. "That's not the same thing," Noah said. Caleb looked at him. 7 years old, and already understanding the distinction between permission and welcome, which was more than most adults managed. "You're right," he said. "But in this case, I think it's both." Yet Antchin. There were about 30 people inside, which was, given the scale of the space, a number that produced intimacy rather than density. Arthur found them within 5 minutes of arrival, with the easy navigation of a man on his own territory, and he greeted Noah directly before he greeted Caleb, which Caleb noted and which Noah responded to by standing slightly straighter. "I'm glad you came," Arthur said. He looked at the red toolbox. "Is that the famous toolbox?" Noah looked up at Caleb. "You told him about it?" "He mentioned it," Caleb said, regarded Arthur with a new assessment. "It's mine," he said. "I've had it since I was 4. "Then it has good history," Arthur said, with the seriousness he brought to all objects that had accumulated time. "Come in. There are people I want you to meet, Caleb, and there's a room in the back with some cars in it that Noah might find interesting." The room in the back was a private showroom, 6 vehicles, 2 of which Caleb recognized immediately, and one of which made him stop walking and stand there for a moment, because he hadn't expected to see one in private hands in this country. Released into the space, moved between the cars, with the careful reverence he'd learned from his life in a garage, not touching, just looking, circling each one in the way his father circled problems, methodically and from every angle. Caleb watched his son for a moment before Arthur led him back toward the main room. Yes, he'd intervened. The people Arthur wanted him to meet were not what he'd expected, which meant he'd been expecting the wrong thing. He'd assumed collectors' people with money and enthusiasm, and a particular kind of knowledge that was wide and detailed about the objects they loved, and narrower about most else. Some of them were that. Arthur had also invited 3 engineers, 2 of them active in the industry and 1 retired, and 2 restoration specialists who worked at a level that Caleb knew of professionally without having known their names personally. Was with these people that the evening took a shape he hadn't planned for. The retired engineer was a woman named Dr. Petra Souza, 71, who had spent most of her career at a German manufacturer, and whose research on harmonic compensation in high-performance engines had been, Caleb realized about 6 minutes into their conversation, cited in the same Munich paper that had cited his own work. "You're Whitaker," she said, when Arthur introduced him. As a question. "Yes," he said. "I read your draft," she said. "I've read it 4 times, different years, different reasons." She looked at him with the directness of someone who has long since stopped softening assessments for social comfort. The section on harmonic displacement was incomplete. He said, "I've been finishing it." Something shifted in her expression. "Since when?" "Since October," he said. "What changed in October?" He thought about how to answer this. "A car I needed to understand," he said, "and a reason to understand it." Petra looked at him for a long moment. "There's a symposium in April," she said. "Technical conference. Small 80, 90 people, all working in this area. I'm chairing a session on modification engineering and historical vehicle integrity. I'd like you to present." Caleb was quiet. "A 20-minute paper," she said. "Whatever you've finished of the displacement section. Even incomplete, it's more substantive than half of what I've been submitted." He stopped. He'd been about to say that he wasn't in that world anymore, which was the sentence he'd been saying for 8 years, and which had been true for 8 years, and which he was aware of this, standing in Arthur Pembroke's private showroom in January, with a 7-year-old examining a 1962 Lancia 30 feet away, possibly becoming less true in ways he was still measuring. "I'd need to think about it," he said. Petra nodded. "Think about it," she said. "But think seriously. That research deserves to exist in a form people can actually access." She paused. "I'll tell you something I've never told anyone in this room. 20 years ago, when I was trying to solve a resonance problem in a prototype engine that my entire team had declared unsolvable, I sat with your framework for 2 days. Found the answer in the relationship between 2 variables you'd identified as adjacent." She said it without drama. "I never published the source because the draft wasn't citable. I should have found another way to attribute it." Caleb stood with that for a moment. This was the thing about the work, about the real work, the kind that came from actually understanding rather than from competence alone. Even when you didn't. And it found people who needed it, and it worked in them. They built things with it, and those things went into the world without you knowing. And you were there the whole time in a 2-bay garage thinking you'd stepped out of the river, understanding that stepping out of the river doesn't stop the river. "April," he said. "3rd week," Petra said. "I'll send you the submission details." He spent The rest of the evening in conversations that moved differently than most conversations in his life, with people who were interested in the specific things he was interested in, and who had the vocabulary for it, who disagreed with each other in the productive way that people disagree when they're not performing, but actually trying to get somewhere. He was rusty. He felt it the places where the professional habit of thinking out loud had atrophied, the moments where he reached for a reference and found the gap that 8 years had put there. Rusty was not broken. Rusty was just time, and time was reversible in ways that mattered. At 9 o'clock, he went to find Noah. Noah was in the showroom, sitting on the floor with his back against the wheel well of the 1962 Lancia, the red toolbox open beside him, talking to a woman Caleb didn't recognize. Was perhaps 40, with the paint-stained fingers of someone who worked with their hands, and she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, across from Noah, with the complete attention of someone who had found the most interesting person in the building. And he uses the stethoscope to listen, Noah was saying, because the engine makes sounds, and if you know what the sounds mean, you can figure out what's wrong. Like a doctor, the woman said. Noah considered this. Sort of. Except doctors don't fix what they find. My dad does both. The woman looked up when Caleb approached. Your son, she said, has been explaining Venturi's resonance methodology to me for the past 20 minutes. With a fairly high degree of accuracy, Caleb looked at Noah, looked back at him with the expression of someone who doesn't see what the fuss is about. Said simply. Apparently, Caleb said. The woman stood and extended a hand. Marguerite Voss. I restore motorcycles, mostly. Your son tells me you're working on Arthur's 1968. I am, Caleb said. He says it sounds different from the Speciale. It does. Earlier period, different modification logic. The resonance pattern has an asymmetry that's original to the design. Marguerite looked at him with the specific interest of someone who works with their hands and has just encountered someone who works with their hands in a way they didn't expect to find here. Love to see the assessment sometime. If that's something you'd consider sharing. I can do that, Caleb said. Send me your contact. She did. He added her to his phone with the slightly self-conscious awareness that he was adding people to his phone again, plural, for professional reasons, and that this was a behavior he had discontinued 8 years ago and was apparently reinstating without having made a formal decision to do so. They drove home at 10, Noah asleep in the passenger seat before they'd left the private road, the red toolbox held loosely in his hands even in sleep. Caleb drove through the January dark and thought about Petra Souza and the April symposium and the section of the notebook that was still 30% unfinished and the way his son had sat on the floor of a private showroom and explained. Resonance methodology, the truism with confidence of someone who has absorbed a thing so thoroughly it simply belongs to them now. He thought about Elena. He thought about her, the way he'd learned to think about her over the years, not the grief of it, which had changed shape many times and would probably change shape again. But the specific person, the details that didn't fade the way other things faded. The way she'd held her coffee mug with both hands, even in summer. The way she'd read anything left in front of her, boxes, instruction manuals, backs of shampoo bottles, with the same level of genuine attention. Yes, he'd cheated Otto. The way she'd looked at the first time, not with the overwhelming emotion you see depicted in these moments, but with something quieter, more like recognition, as if she'd known him before she met him. He thought about what she would make of tonight. He thought she would have talked to everyone at the gathering, effortlessly and genuinely, and would have come away with 3 follow-up plans and a new friend and some specific piece of information about someone's life that she'd mentioned to Caleb months later as if it had just occurred to her. He thought she would have found Noah on the floor with Marguerite Voss and taken a photograph and said something about it later. At home, that made Caleb laugh. He thought she would have told him to go to the symposium. No, gently, directly, the way she did everything. He parked behind the shop. He carried Noah upstairs 7 years old, and still light enough, barely, for this to be possible without waking him, a fact that Caleb registered each time as a kind of countdown, and put him in bed with the red toolbox on the floor beside him, where it always went, and stood in the doorway for a moment before going back down the shop. He stood at switch for a while without turning the lights up, all the way, Just the work lamp, the small circle of it, on the surface where the leather notebooks sat. He opened it to the harmonic displacement section. He read what he had. Then he picked up a pen and wrote, not carefully, not with the precision of someone composing, but with the speed of someone who has something to say and has been waiting for the right moment to say it. Moment has apparently arrived at 10:30 at night in January, in a cold garage above which his son is sleeping. He wrote for an hour and 20 minutes. When he stopped, the section was not finished. It was further than it had been since the day he'd stopped. And the shape of the ending was visible now in a way it hadn't been before, not as a conclusion he was manufacturing, but as something the argument had always been moving toward, and he could finally see arriving. He closed the notebook. He made a note on his phone, Sousa April Symposium submission deadline. He went to bed. The 1968 Venturi restoration was completed on the 28th of February, which was a Thursday, which meant Noah was at school when Caleb ran the engine for the first time after the full installation. He'd planned vaguely to wait and run it when Noah was there. The compulsion to know overcame the plan, as it usually does, and he turned the key alone in Bay 2 with the shop quiet around him. The engine started. It found its note different from the Specialized, lower and with that deliberate asymmetry in resonance that he now understood was a signature. Venturi's early period audible in the sound. The way a young writer's voice is audible in their early sentences, specific and still finding its range. It was not a perfect sound. It was a real one, which was better. He sat with it running for 3 minutes. Then he cut it and called Arthur. "It's done," he said. Arthur was quiet for a moment that Caleb had come to understand was his version of an emotional response, the pause where another person might say something, and Arthur chose not to because the silence was more accurate. "I'll come Friday," he said. "Bring whoever you want," Caleb said. Arthur brought no one. He came alone on a gray Friday morning and walked into Bay 2 and stood in front of the 1968 with his hands in his coat pockets, and Caleb stood to the side and let him have the silence he needed with it. After a while, Arthur walked around the car slowly, the way he'd walked around it the first time he'd come to the shop, except that now the oxidized rocker panel had been treated, and the fascia repair had been properly finished, and the engine was correct in ways it hadn't been for 40 years. He stopped on the driver's side. "Start it for me," he said. Caleb got in and turned the key. The engine came up with the same voice it had found the day before, settled into its note, held it. Arthur listened. His eyes were closed. Caleb watched him through the windshield, a man in his mid-60s who had spent 11 years tracking this car and acquiring it, and trying to restore it correctly, standing in a two-bay garage on the less fashionable side of the city, with his eyes closed listening to an engine that had been wrong for most of his ownership of it and was now right. There, Arthur said, not to Caleb, to himself, or to the car, or to whatever version of the past he was settling something with. Caleb cut the engine. Arthur stood there for another moment. Then he opened his eyes. He looked at Caleb. "The documentation," he said. His voice was level, professionally so, but Caleb heard the thing underneath it. "Complete. I'll have the full restoration record to you by end of week, including the findings on the original asymmetry. I've written it up as a formal addendum, so it's part of the car's permanent history." Arthur nodded. He looked at the 1968 one more time, and then looked away, with the deliberate intention of someone putting something down that they've been carrying. "The second Venturi," he said. "The 1974. I'd like to bring it to you in April, if your schedule allows." "April works," Caleb said. "I have something the third week I'll be out of town for a few days, but the rest of the month is open." Arthur looked at him. "The symposium? Sousa sent me the submission details. She told me she'd invited you," Arthur said. "She didn't tell me whether you'd accepted." "I haven't formally submitted yet," Caleb said. "But I'm going to." Arthur looked at him with the expression of a man who has been patient about something for longer than was comfortable, and is now being told the waiting is over. It was not a dramatic expression. It was quiet in the way that most of the things that mattered between them had been quiet. He said, "Then is Noah here today?" "School. He's back at 3. Tell him the car thanks him." Caleb looked at him. He spent 20 minutes explaining resonance theory to Marguerite, Voss, Arthur said. She called me the following Monday and said she'd found the January gathering unexpectedly useful. She attributed most of it to your 7-year-old. He said it with something that was definitely in the smile territory now. Tell him, Caleb said he would. He submitted the symposium paper on a Tuesday night in February, 2 weeks before the restoration was completed, because Petra Souza had called him to ask if he was going to, and he'd said yes, and then understood from the way she said good that the deadline was closer than he'd been treating it. The paper was 22 pages, which was longer than she'd asked for, and shorter than it wanted to be, and it contained the harmonic displacement analysis completed for the first time in its entirety, including the conclusions he'd been moving toward 8 years ago when he'd stopped, and which he'd finally reached over the course of 4 months, and 2 Venturi engines, and an hour and 20 minutes on a January night in a cold garage. He sent it without reading it back a 4th time, because reading it a 4th time would have produced a 5th time, and then a 6th, and there was a version of perfectionism that was actually avoidance wearing a technical justification. Petra responded at 6 the following morning. This is exactly what I was hoping for. See you in April, he told Noah that morning at breakfast. What's the symposium? Noah asked. A conference, where engineers and specialists present research. Like show and tell? Caleb considered this. Yes, he said. Exactly like show and tell. But longer, and the things you show are ideas. Is it far? Other side of the country? I'd fly. Was quiet for a moment. Noah was quiet for a moment, working through the logistics of this in the way he worked through anything that affected their arrangements. Who would watch me? Grandma's offered. Or Mrs. Kim next door. We'd figure it out. How long? 3 days. Maybe 4. Turned this over. He ate a spoonful of the oat cereal he'd stopped campaigning for the colored kind, which Caleb had noticed without remarking on, and looked at his father with the 7-year-old version of the assessment he'd been giving things his whole life. You should go, he said. Yeah? Yeah, it's important. How do you know it's important? Noah looked at him with the directness he'd had since birth. Because you wrote it for a really long time, and you went to a lot of trouble, he said. Things you do that for are important. Caleb sat with that. He didn't have a response that matched it, so he didn't try to find one. He just sat there with his coffee and his son and the oat cereal and the morning light coming in through the window over the alley, where Mrs. Pacheco's mop was on its hook right on schedule. Okay, he said. Okay, Noah said, and went back to his cereal. Adeline heard about the symposium from Arthur, who heard about the submission from Petra, who apparently had more channels of communication with Arthur Pembroke than Caleb had understood. Adeline texted him the Wednesday after he submitted. Heard you're presenting in April. About time. He read it and didn't immediately respond because he was under a car and his hands were occupied. And by the time his hands were free, the response felt less urgent but also more considered, which was probably better. He wrote back, You knew about the symposium? Petra mentioned it in November. I may have passed your name to Arthur with that in mind. Caleb stood at the workbench and read this. Then you engineered this. Her response took a minute. I facilitated an introduction between people who had relevant interests in common. Whether that's engineering is a philosophical question. He thought about the park in October and the conversation in the garage the night she came to ask for help, the advice about Arthur's negotiation, and the birthday card to Noah with the car on it. He thought about all of it arranged in sequence. As manipulation, he didn't think it was manipulation, but as the behavior of a person who paid attention to things and used what she noticed not for herself, but for something she thought was right. He wrote back, Thank you. Her response, Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see how they receive a 22-page paper when you said 20 minutes. He laughed at that. In the shop by himself on a Thursday morning, a short and genuine sound that surprised him with its completeness. He called her that evening. It was the first time he'd called her rather than responded to contact from her, and he was aware of this as though phone rang, aware of the line it crossed, or the door it opened. Whatever the right spatial metaphor was for the thing that happens when two people stop being the people who met in a crisis and become, instead, something with its own forward momentum. She picked up on the third ring. Is something wrong with the car? He said. Both cars are fine. Then what? I wanted to ask you something, he said. A pause. Okay. Arthur's gathering in January, he said. There's a woman there, Marguerite Voss. You know her? I know of her. We've met twice. She restores motorcycles. She asked to share the 1,968 assessment. I did. She came back with some questions that were she's good. She thinks differently than the engine people, but the principles translate. And the conversation was, he stopped, started again more accurately. I'm describing this wrong. What I'm trying to say is that since October, I've been having conversations I stopped having 8 years ago. And I'd forgotten how much the thinking changes when there's someone to think against. Adeline was quiet. I don't know what that is, he said. For us, I don't have a framework for it. He stopped a third time, and this time the stop was different, because what came next was true, and he'd known it was true for a while, and hadn't said it, because saying it made it real, in a way he wasn't entirely sure he was ready for. I'm not uninterested in having one, he said. A framework. The silence that followed was the longest she'd given him since the conversation in the garage, when she'd said she hadn't entirely believed her own justifications for walking away on the mezzanine. It was a real silence, the kind that means something is being considered actually, rather than managed. I'm not uninterested either, she said. Her voice was careful, which he'd learned meant she was being precise, not guarded. But I want to say something honestly. Go ahead. I'm not good at this, she said. The way you're not good at letting your work be seen. I'm not good at the part where you let someone in and they can see the things that aren't performing correctly. I'm very good at performing correctly. I've built a significant portion of my life on it. Another pause. It is not the same thing as actually being correct. He thought about Bryce and the mezzanine and the 90 seconds of something she wouldn't call panic after the conversation about the unfixable engine. He thought about her sitting on a parts crate at 10 o'clock at night in a cold service bay because leaving felt wrong and her not examining too closely why it felt wrong. He thought about a birthday card with a car on it, addressed in careful handwriting to a 7-year-old she'd met once. He said, I saw that. And it doesn't. It doesn't change anything, he said. I'm not looking for someone who performs correctly. I've got the shop for that. She made a sound that was almost a laugh, not fully, but it's near relation. The sound that escapes before you decide whether to let it. That's a low bar, she said. It's where the bar is, he said. And they both recognized the echo of the park conversation months ago, and the recognition sat between them warmly. The symposium, she said after a moment. When you come back from April, I'd like to hear about it. In person. I'll tell you about it in person, he said. Good, she said. Good night, Caleb. Good night, he said. He put the phone down on the workbench. The shop was quiet. Bay 2 was empty now. The 1,968 had been picked up by Arthur's transport that afternoon, and the space had the particular quality of rooms that have held something significant and now hold its absence, which is its own kind of presence. The leather notebook was on the workbench. He left it there and went upstairs. Was asleep, the red toolbox on the floor where it always was. Caleb stood in the doorway for the usual moment, long enough to confirm the specific reality of it, the breathing, the slight sprawl. Noah slept, with one arm over the edge of the bed in a posture that looked uncomfortable, but which he'd maintained for years, and which apparently suited him fine. He went to bed. He lay in the dark and thought, in no particular order, about the April symposium and the 1,974 Venturi and the unfinished conversation with Adeline that was finished for now but would continue, about the way Noah had said it was important because he'd spent a long time on it and gone to a lot of trouble. As if importance were a function of effort invested rather than recognition received. As if the value of a thing was determined by how seriously the person making it took it, not by whether anyone was watching. He'd lived by a version of this idea without ever stating it clearly, and hearing his son say a 7-year-old's plain language had done something to him meant that he was still processing. The truth was, and this was the thing he'd been learning, slowly over these months, through engines and notebooks and cold service bays and park benches and phone calls that lasted longer than logistics, required the truth was that he had never actually stepped out of the river. He had stood very still in it for 8 years, and the standing still had looked from the outsides like stopping, and had felt from the inside like stopping. But the current had continued, and he had continued in it. The work had continued in him, whether he worked or not. And Noah had grown and absorbed and was now sitting on floors at gatherings and explaining resonance theory with a red toolbox beside him, like it was the most natural thing in the world. Which it was, because it was his father's world, and his father's world was the only world he'd ever lived in. And children are not separate from their parents' lives. They are made of them. The thing Caleb had feared most, in the years after Elena, the thing that had kept him small and still and refusing, the thing that had dressed itself as love and protection, and the wisdom of prioritizing what mattered was that returning to the work would cost him his son. The two lives couldn't coexist, that he would have to choose. He hadn't chosen. He'd simply waited long enough that the false choice revealed itself. The work hadn't taken him away from Noah. It had given Noah something to sit beside. He understood this fully, lying in the dark in January, in the way you understand things that have been true for a while, and that you finally have the right language for. It wasn't a revelation. It was a recognition, the quieter and more durable of the two. In the spring, Caleb Whitaker went to the symposium. He presented for 23 minutes, 1 minute over, which Petra forgave in the way teachers forgive students who have something real to say. The room was smaller than he'd imagined and more attentive than he'd expected. And the questions afterward were the kind that meant people had actually listened, rather than waited for their turn to speak. Petra chaired the session with the precision of someone who had been doing it for 30 years and saw no reason to perform the role differently now. Marguerite Voss was in the audience. She'd come for a different session and stayed for his, which she told him afterward with the directness he'd come to expect from her. He came home on a Thursday. Noah was at school. Mrs. Kim had dropped him off that morning with the pleasant efficiency of a neighbor who has made a practical decision to be helpful and intends to be good at it. The shop was exactly as Caleb had left it, because he'd cleaned it before he left, with the thoroughness he applied only when something significant was departing or arriving, and the order had held. He stood in Bay 2 for a while. In April, the 1074 Venturi was scheduled to arrive. He had the notebook and the stethoscope and the new fluorescent light that didn't buzz, and he had the section on harmonic displacement completed in a form that now existed in the world, in a way that other people could find and use, which had turned out to matter to him more than he'd expected. He had Adeline, in whatever form that was going to take, which he didn't need to define completely before it could begin. He had Arthur and Petra and Marguerite and the retired architect Mr. Voss and Dale with his old truck and Mr. Delgado's truck, which would inevitably return, and Mrs. Pacheco's mop on its hook every morning in the alley. He had the shop. He had the work. He had Noah. At 3 o'clock, he drove to school and waited in the pickup line with the other parents, some of whom he recognized by vehicle, if not by name, the minivan with the peeling bumper sticker, the red SUV that always cut the line by 2 car lengths, and the tan station wagon with the dog in the back, who watched everything with restless authority. Ordinary things. The ordinary things that make up most of a life, the parts that don't get told because they don't appear to be the story, but which are, in fact, the entire structure that holds the story up. Came out with his backpack and his lunchbox, the particular energy of a child who has been inside all day and is now returned to open air, spotted the car, and came toward it at the specific pace that was neither the run of someone who'd forgotten all dignity, nor the walk of someone pretending they hadn't seen. He got in. He looked at Caleb with the evaluative directness he'd had since birth. "How was it?" he said. "Good," Caleb said. "Did they like your research?" "They asked good questions," Caleb said. "Which is better." Considered this distinction, and apparently found it sound. He settled into the seat with his backpack on his lap, looking out at the street, and Caleb pulled out of the line into the afternoon traffic. He drove 3 blocks in comfortable silence. Then Noah said, "I put the plastic wrench in the wrong spot." Caleb glanced at him. "What? In the toolbox last week?" "I was reorganizing, and I put the big plastic wrench in the middle row, but it belongs in the bottom because it's the heaviest." He said it with the seriousness of someone reporting a structural error. I should have caught that. Caleb looked at his son, 7 years old, with a battered red plastic toolbox on his lap, and his mother's eyes, and a knowledge of where every toy wrench belonged, and why, and the confidence to state without any performance of it, that his father had fixed an engine that 6 other people couldn't fix. The wisdom says that the symposium mattered because going to a lot of trouble was how you knew something was important. We'll fix it when we get home, Caleb said. Noah nodded, satisfied. He looked out the window at the city going about its afternoon. Can we get the colored cereal? Can we get hot chocolate from the place? It's a Thursday. That's not a reason. You're right, Caleb said. That's not a reason. They got hot chocolate from the place. They drove home through the April afternoon, father and son, with the toolbox between them and the cities outside the windows, and the shop waiting at the end of the drive, with its 2 bays and its workbench and its wooden stool in the corner, and the leather notebook beside the lamp with the last section finally done, and Bay 2 cleared and ready for whatever was coming next. Nothing about it was perfect. All of it was real. That, Caleb had learned, was the better of the two.